Pack your bags. Here's what it's like to travel across borders in 2021. Hi there, it's Jeff, and this is Plain English lesson number 404. JR is the producer, and he has uploaded the full lesson to plainenglish.com/404. That's where you'll find the transcripts, how-to video translations, and more. Coming up today, I recently took a 10-day vacation to Europe in which I visited 3 countries and passed through a 4th. And so I got an up-close and personal lesson on the administrative nightmare that is cross-border travel in 2021. On today's lesson, I'll tell you about all the things you need to think about before heading on an overseas vacation. The English expression we'll review today is get back on your feet, and we have a quote of the week. "18 months after the COVID-19 pandemic shut borders and brought international travel to a standstill, the tourism industry is starting to get back on its feet. But that doesn't mean travel is back to normal. Cross-border travel in 2021 is characterized by a thicket of fast-changing rules and regulations. Some countries, such as Australia, China, and New Zealand, are still very cautious about allowing any type of cross-border travel. Other countries have few restrictions on incoming travel. However, it's safe to say that most international travel happens within a region. Europeans can travel freely within Europe, for example, and Americans can easily vacation in Mexico, while Mexicans can easily come to America. If you dare travel farther afield, though, you'll need to take into account several things. First, can you even go? Second, what are the testing requirements? Next, will you have to quarantine? Do you need a vaccination? What documents will you have to show? And what do you need to get back? Let's start with number 1. Can you even go? Most countries operate on some kind of a traffic light system, which is like a sliding scale of restrictions. Travelers from red locations face mandatory quarantines or may not be allowed in, whereas travelers from green locations may be allowed in without any restrictions at all. Unfortunately, every country has its own rules, so before you travel, you need to check whether you're allowed in to each place or not. If you have to quarantine, be prepared for that quarantine to be enforced. Some countries have special quarantine hotels attached to the airport. Australia and the UK are two examples. If you are in quarantine, expect to not leave your room. Meals will be delivered to you. You might be able to get out of quarantine early if you test negative once or twice within the first week. However, assuming you're exempt from quarantine, you still have to comply with a number of rules. One of the most common requirements is a PCR test. A PCR test is the most detailed and accurate type of COVID test available. The at-home tests and the instant tests available in pharmacies and drive-through sites are typically antigen tests, which are less accurate. Those generally do not qualify for travel, though they do in some cases. To get a PCR test, you need to make an appointment at a hospital or a testing center. You typically need to pay, and you typically need to wait for the results to be analyzed in a lab. Those can be done in a few hours or a few days. It's the traveler's responsibility to time it right. Most countries require the test to be done within 3 days of travel. Britain, however, doesn't stop there. If you travel to the UK, you not only need a PCR test to get in, but you also need a PCR test after a few days in the country. They won't let you in the country unless you've made this second appointment and paid for it. So these are the testing requirements. As you may have guessed, they don't just take your word for it. You need to bring documentation of the testing, and that documentation must be in the correct language. You cannot show up in London with a PCR test done in Turkish. You can't go to Austria with a PCR test in Italian. Each country publishes the testing requirements and the language requirements. And you guessed it, the traveler is responsible for getting the tests in the right language. Now, that's not all the documentation. Many countries require you to fill out an entry form before you present yourself at the airport or cross the border. Depending on where you're going, you may also need to show proof of vaccination. We Americans like to show our vaccination proof by showing a picture of our vaccination cards on our phones. That doesn't work everywhere. You may need that original document. Direct flights are amazing, aren't they? If you've got a direct flight, you're in luck. But if you have to connect in a third country, then your testing and administrative requirements may have just gotten more complicated. The UK, which hosts a lot of transfer passengers at Heathrow Airport has its own set of requirements for passengers simply passing through the airport. That's right, even if you don't leave the four walls of Heathrow Airport, you still have to follow some of the UK's COVID requirements. So let's say you successfully cross the border and you're in a new country and you've passed all the requirements. You now have to follow that country's local rules for containing the pandemic. That might mean masks, proof of vaccination, things like that. Austria and Germany, for example, require surgical masks, not the disposable paper masks or fashionable cloth masks that work almost everywhere else. Got all that? Good, because the fun doesn't stop there. You now need to follow this whole process in reverse if you want to go home. And if you think your home country will take you back just because you're a citizen, you might want to check that. America requires all travelers, vaccinated or not, citizen or not, to have a PCR test before coming home. It's confusing to keep this all straight. The official place to get information about travel restrictions is each government's website. However, these are not always clear. The best source of information online, according to my research, is a website called Sherpa at joinsherpa.com. I read an article a few weeks back saying that this thicket of regulations would pose a major barrier to tourism, and I didn't really believe it. My feeling was, so what? You fill out the forms, you get your test. How hard can that be? Well, having gone through this process, I can tell you that it's a real burden and it adds stress to your trip. Hungary was changing entry requirements for Americans right up until a week or two before I left. I think a week before I went, the EU advised member countries to tighten restrictions on Americans. And what I didn't realize is that PCR tests are expensive, especially if you want rapid results. They're covered by insurance in America, but they can be expensive in Europe. I think I paid 85 euros for my test in Austria. But imagine if I had a family of 5, however, and imagine I needed 2 sets of tests, one before leaving and one coming home. That's 850 euros right there just on testing for a family. And then, if just one person gets COVID before the trip, then the whole holiday is ruined. If just one person gets COVID during the trip, then it can be a lot worse. So, my conclusion from all this is that I would not take a family on a trip. I would not go in a large group either. One person, a couple, okay, but I would not do a group or family trip at this time. There's just too much that can go wrong. On Thursday's lesson, I'll take you step by step through my travel and what I had to do to get to each place. I'll tell you who checked what documents, how I got them, how I almost didn't get a PCR test on time, all that stuff, so you know exactly how this worked in my case. Today's expression is to get back on your feet. It's helpful here to picture someone being knocked down to the ground, maybe in a fight. The person can either stay down or he can get back on his feet. When someone gets back on his feet in a fight, he's ready to continue fighting. But we most often use this metaphorically. When you're going through a bad time, you might feel like you've been knocked down. But when you're ready to move on, when you're ready to continue with your life, you get back on your feet. Imagine you know someone who just went through a messy breakup. That feels terrible. The person is probably going through a few weeks or months of gloomy feelings or worse. But eventually, hopefully, your friend gets back on his feet. When he starts to recover, when he starts to feel better, when he's ready to resume his life, he gets back on his feet. He's ready to fight another day. It can happen at work too. You might lose a big customer, lose a grant, face an unexpected expense. Maybe a key coworker quits and leaves you high and dry. You might go through a few days or weeks of lower productivity, but eventually you, as a team or a business, can get back on your feet. You can recover your energy. You can go win a new customer, hire a new employee, whatever. You're back in business. You're putting the bad days behind you. You're back on your feet. That's what I said is happening with the tourism industry as a whole. They're not totally recovered from the meltdown of 2020, but they're back on their feet. Borders are starting to open. People are vaccinated. Museums and attractions are open. And people are feeling comfortable traveling again. Sure, it isn't like before. Entire countries like China and Australia are off limits, but the tourism industry is starting to get back on its feet. The flights I took were half to 3/4 full. People were in the museums. There was a line outside popular restaurants. The tourism industry is back on its feet. Now, a lot of people who work in the tourism industry have to get back on their feet too. We talked about music venues that had to shut down during the pandemic. All the bartenders, servers, bands, workers at attractions, they all need to get back on their feet after being out of a job for so long. Today's quote of the week is from Oscar Wilde, a famous British writer. Now, before anyone gets mad at me, I'm going to say that I saw this quote on the cover of a menu in Vienna, okay? So don't say I'm being insensitive by choosing this quote. I saw it in a German-speaking country. Here's the quote. Oscar Wilde says, "Life is too short to learn German." I laughed when I saw it. The cafe near my apartment in Vienna had an English menu and a German menu. The cafe was also a bookshop, so it had a literary vibe. And on the cover of the English menu, it had that quote from Oscar Wilde, "Life is too short to learn German." Now, this was my first trip in a long time to a country that isn't either English or Spanish speaking. I've been in my comfort zone traveling to Mexico, Colombia, Spain, India, Ireland, and London. The last time I was in a country that did not officially speak English or Spanish was 2013, so it's been a while. It was good to get out of my comfort zone and not be embarrassed about not speaking the local language. As Oscar Wilde says, life is too short to learn German. And that's all for today, Monday, October 4th, 2021. Remember, this full lesson is available at plainenglish.com/404. JR has made sure of that. Coming up on Thursday, I'll take you step by step through everything I had to do to stay compliant with the rules in the 5 countries I visited during this trip. That's on Thursday. See you then.